Like these last year, we were selling them at $4.99, the watermelons. Now they're $8.99.
We all feel it. The price of food keeps going up. Grocery store owner Eli and James wrestles with it too.
The romaine lettuce, 3 pieces, we'd sell that at $2.99 in the past, and it's at $6.99 now. Romaine lettuce loose, again, we used to sell them at $1.49, now they're at $3. This is because prices have increased. The peppers are another crazy. We're paying $90 for a 3-kilo box and try to make money on a pepper.
Well, Eli is trying to make at least some money on peppers and lettuce in order to balance his books. This week, the federal government opened up its books to show how it's spending our tax dollars. I'm Catherine Cullen. This week on The House, we've got the finance minister. We're going to ask whether he's doing enough to help people get by and what he thinks of that idea of publicly run grocery stores. We've also got 2 of this country's leading business watchers. We're going to talk about Mark Carney's pitch for a sovereign wealth fund. Source of the wealth? TBD. And then we're going to talk to acclaimed historian Timothy Snyder, the author of On Tyranny. He has advice for how Canadians should talk to their U.S. friends in the time of Trump, and why he says no country should think it is immune from authoritarian pressures, and yes, that includes Canada. But on a week where the government says it's supporting Canadians with the cost of living, we're going to start with a potentially pricey trip to the grocery store. The House is now in session.
Okay, we'll start from the back corner over here, and we'll walk this way. We got our pasta section, our canned section. We have beans, nuts, your special tahini sauces, and your oils. Like we got oils and vinegars, that lots of them.
It's obvious Eli and James is pretty proud of his grocery store. It's called the Mideast Food Center. It's family-owned, and it's been around for nearly 4 decades. In the last few years, Eli says prices on a lot of foods have shot up. Customers aren't happy. Neither is he.
Could you show us some other products in particular where you're really sort of feeling the price squeeze right now?
Oh, the price squeeze is we're gonna walk over there. It's more vegetables now, right? So vegetables have gone crazy. Chicken and beef has gone up in price also. So beef has gone crazy. When we used to sell to restaurants ground beef at $10 and $11 a kilo, it's up to $16 a kilo, and they're having a hard time paying for it. So they're looking for a cheaper quality or a cheaper company. We lose that business.
What I'm hearing from you, though, about setting the prices is there's really no question. The supplier raises the price and you just raise it proportionately?
So the gas price is up. So every delivery car, now they got it on the bottom of the bill, $20 service gas tax. And they're saying it's all dictated to this. So gas prices have gone crazy. A diesel is over $2 a liter. And these truckers are coming and they're saying to me, well, if you can't load up $2,000 worth of stuff, we can't deliver to you. So you're going to be out of product.
Okay, let's go take a look. You were saying it's really the produce where you're feeling the pinch?
So the produce, for example, you take tomatoes. When about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, I was selling them at $15 a case. Now it's costing me $50 a case.
$50 a case? And
tomatoes.
What do you know about why that is?
They're telling me that it's shortage. They're telling me that if they're coming in from Mexico, it's all on delivery charges. They're telling me that, and even these companies, you call them today and they're going to tell you I have 3 skids, and then you call them tomorrow morning, they say we don't have anything left, and we won't have any for another 3 or 4 days. Now we loaded up on a lot of tomatoes. Our prices should start coming down because we bought from a local guy some, I'd say a cheaper version of it. It's a local tomato, it's Ontario-based tomato, but it's coming down from Leamington, so they're starting to bring the prices down.
Do people have conversations with you about the price of groceries, or you see them leaving things behind?
My staff will have conversations with me. What they had a conversation with an actual customer, right? They'll say, I'll see it on the receipt saying, too expensive. So the customer left it behind. They got to the cash, they didn't realize that was $5.49 a pound. They might have thought it was $5.49 a kilo. They got to the cash, they said, oh my God, I'm going to pay this much for tomatoes? No, I'm not paying it. And they'd leave it there. Now, can you make a salad without tomatoes? Yeah, my wife makes a cucumber salad, so that's fine. We'll have a cucumber salad. Cucumbers are a little cheaper, right? But the tomato is always nice in the salad, right?
Hello. Hi. How are you today?
I'm good, you?
Good. $34.76.
I'll pay cash.
It's not just leaving food behind. People get frustrated, too. Just ask cashier Odessa Tavaluli.
What are people saying to you about the price of groceries?
I get complaints almost all the time. And it's like the jump is like, it's not even like a 5%. It's sometimes 25, 30% jump. And it's just unbelievable. And there's no limit to the increase.
Tell me about the last time you remember talking to a person you thought, like, this person can't afford that. They've said to you, I can't afford it, or put it back, or does that happen?
Oh, yeah. All the time, constantly. I have like items that I have to put back on the shelf constantly.
As Paula Shahin loads up her groceries, she's feeling it too.
Everything is going up daily. It's expensive. It's a crisis, for everybody. Big families, we cannot afford anymore, to be honest. You cannot buy like before used to be, If you have families and kids, you buy only necessaries, especially kids, school items, school food,
What more would you like the government to do to help you out?
Reduce prices, put limits for the prices, increase probably support for the families, big families, look at the minimum wage.
All the shoppers we spoke to said they were concerned about prices, and all of them thought the government should be helping at least some Canadians a little bit more. We heard suggestions ranging from price caps in public grocery stores to tax breaks. So what does the man who's responsible for Canada's spending think? This week, Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne unveiled the government's spring economic update. To talk about affordability, as well as some of the other plans in that document, we spoke with him Thursday. Minister Champagne, welcome back to the House.
Thank you very much for having me.
Those shoppers we just heard from, they all told us that at least some Canadians need more help. Some of them talked to us about a tax break. Some wanted a cap on the price of groceries. What would you say to them about why there was no big new affordability measure announced in this document?
Well, I would say first I was very touched by what I've heard from the people. I know this is the main concern of people. If you and I continue to walk in that store, you would hear stories of affordability all over. It's about affordable housing. It's about grocery. It's about gas. When it comes to the grocery, I would say I was listening to the mother in particular. She was talking about her kids. We've done a couple of things. I mean, the first thing was the National School Food Program to help families. She was saying, what about the kids and how can we do more? We made that permanent, which is a testament to, I would say, leading in a fiscally prudent way, but being there with people with your heart. I know that for many families, this is making a huge difference. The other thing, on the 5th of June, you're going to see that boost in the grocery and essentials benefit. Since COVID, we've seen excess inflation in food. And that's really what the Prime Minister and I tried to address. We said we're going to give a boost to people to kind of capture a bit of that excess inflation that we have seen during the COVID period. And then we're going to increase the grocery benefits so that it's going to smooth the trend for people. And at the same time, and I'm happy the gentleman talked about meat, is that we need to change structurally how we do that. We need more facilities. We need more packaging facilities. We need more greenhouses, because he mentioned meat, but there's also things like if you look at fresh produce, we import about 30% of them, and when you go to the winter, it's about 70%, and that makes you dependent on currency, on trade, on climate events. So we just need to be more resilient when it comes to food production in the country, and that's really a focus. If you ask me when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I think is how can I help people to make life more affordable?
And yet we often hear you talking about all these indicators that the Canadian economy is doing relatively well. I mean, in question period all the time, you're bringing up these indicators. And yet you hear the anxiety that people are facing. How do you make sense of that? Do you think people are right to feel anxious right now?
Well, I mean, it's because the economy is doing well that we can help people. You're quite right. I mean, when I was in Washington recently, the word that was used was the cloud of uncertainty is wrapping the world. And when you look at Canada, we are the second fastest growing economy. We grow twice as much as Germany, twice as much as Japan, 3 times more than Italy, more than the UK, more than France. So what is that doing is that it gives us the fiscal capacity to help people. And if you look at the additional revenues we got, and we highlight that in the spring update, 2/3 of that has gone to the people to help on housing, to help with the grocery benefit. Because once the economy grows, this is how, as Canadians, not just the government, Catherine, it's us as citizens, we decide to help those who need it most when we have additional revenue. That's very Canadian in our values. We want a Canada for all, and those are the some people ask me, why didn't you put all the money towards the deficit? Well, because we need to help people where they are, and we need to give them a boost now and a bridge to the future. That's the choice we've made, is that to be compassionate.
Is the compassionate thing to do, if oil prices remain high, use some of that additional tax revenue to give people another break in the next few months if people are still struggling like this?
Well, 2 things I would say. What you've seen in the update is not really an oil story, because, the conflict started on the 28th of February, and the projections closed the beginning of March. So what you've seen rather is the resiliency of the Canadian economy, the resiliency of Canadian workers, because a lot of people were wondering, because of the Canadian economy is intertwined with the U.S. economy and the tariff, that, there was a lot of worry out there is how we're going to do as a country. And actually, what we're seeing is that Canada is a far more resilient country than a lot of people might have expected. So it's not an old story. I just wanted to perhaps point that. Now, your point is quite right. I mean, we've seen higher oil prices. No one has a crystal ball. I mean, even Fatih Birol, which is the Director General of the International Energy Agency, said this is the biggest energy shock that we have ever seen. So clearly, like you said, it calls on us to be prudent. If you ask me as the Finance Minister of Canada, I have to be prudent because no one can predict the future. It's very volatile and complex. But at the same time, if there's additional revenue like we've seen, the Prime Minister and I and our colleagues, we did what the compassionate thing to do, which is to say, okay, we get it, especially on grocery. I would say if you ask me something that I hear the most is probably related to grocery. We're making headways with respect to affordable housing. On the gas side, we provided the relief, the suspension of the federal excise tax. But on grocery, it's a very complex supply chain. We need to keep an eye with the Competition Bureau, need to grow more in the country and make sure that, we are a bit more resilient when it comes to food production in our country.
Well, another solution that one political party is advancing, the NDP, has talked about publicly run grocery stores, an idea where essentially the government would be responsible for running the stores in some fashion, and there would be a reduction in prices. Is that something this federal government would consider, publicly run grocery stores?
To be honest, I've not seen a lot of example of that in G7 countries, in terms of, I wonder if Canadians would want to see, government start running stores, if you see what I mean. I think what people would want to see is us to take measures to structurally improve the food production in our country, to provide more food security across the nation. I think if you and I were walking on the street, I think people would be probably somewhat questioning whether the government itself runs stores. I think it's more about, when we put these measures in place, yes, there's the grocery benefit, but I spoke to farmer associations across the nation that they said, help us more with abattoirs around the country, help us more with, for example, refrigeration facilities across the country, help us with the logistics across the country, help us with greenhouse, where we can certainly increase the supply of food. So that was more, when I talked to the people who produce actually the food that we consume, they were more about structural measures to help having more domestic production in Canada.
One of your other big announcements this week was the creation of a sovereign wealth fund, a sort of state-owned investment account. We just heard from people who are struggling to buy groceries to feed their families. How do you explain to them that you're prioritizing $25 billion for this sovereign wealth fund, which they likely can't afford to invest in, versus giving them more relief?
Well, people understand that we need to do what's right now, but I suspect if you and I were in the store together, people would want to see also us looking further. like saying, okay, what are you going to do for my kids and future generation? Sovereign wealth fund is like a collective investments and savings account. And if you look at the Nordic countries, this has paid great dividends to the people who have created these instruments. Now, if you look at the international press, what I like much is they were saying this is a sovereign wealth fund in a very Canadian way. So not only you can create collective wealth, but at the same time offering the opportunity for people to co-invest. Because, for most people listening, you would not have the ability by yourself to really invest like in these new national projects, whether you're talking about interties, whether you're talking about critical minerals, these big projects that's going to be built in our country. So this is really giving an opportunity for people to say, if I have a bit of money and I want, it's a great way to be part of the story. If you can't or you don't want, well, collective wealth will be created and we're all going to benefit. Now, to your question about the contribution, you have to think now I'm getting into the weeds a bit of the accounting, but because you're putting the money there, but you also have an asset that you record. So in a way, since Canada can borrow on the international market because of our credit rating, which is one of the best, it's AAA, we can borrow at probably some of the lowest costs. So for us, we can make that money work for people so that they get a higher return.
I do want to understand this, Minister, because you're talking about borrowing. Is the idea, it's $25 billion over 3 years, this is all going to be borrowed money, which would, of course, make it different from other sovereign wealth funds which use profits? Or do you have a revenue source in mind? Because I heard you talking about privatizing airports this week. Could that pay for the sovereign wealth fund?
There's other assets. You need to start. By the way, we're not the only one who started like that. You just need seed money to start. But after that, yes, we're looking at different assets where we can get full value of federal assets. And I think in a way we need to start, in my view, modernizing the way we approach public assets in this country. Many of our peers around the world have been making a similar exercise to look at how you can get best value for citizens in terms of improved services, in terms of investment. So we said, yes, there'll be a bit of seed money, a bit of seed capital to start. But clearly, to your point, there will be assets contributed which will generate revenues. And that's how you create over time a very interesting national savings and investments account for Canadians. And like I said, countries which have done that, because time is your best friend in investment, as everyone knows. So you and I think if we were going back to the families you interviewed, they would say, we understand we need to do things now. But I think people also look forward and say, but we also need to do things to make sure that the prosperity and we create opportunities for our children and grandchildren as a nation is going to build, because we're going to build all these things. And I think the Prime Minister and I's vision was to say, but we want people to be part of that story. We want, if they want, they can even co-invest so that everyone benefits, from that wealth creation that we're going to see with major projects.
Thank you for making the time, Minister.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne. So the minister sees a clear path forward on this sovereign wealth fund, but others aren't so sure. The Conservatives, for example, are calling it a sovereign debt fund. Is it a good idea? And what about the government's big pitch to get tens of thousands more people into the skilled trades? To help us make sense of it all, Mark Rendell is an economics reporter for the Globe and Mail. Also with us is the Ottawa bureau chief for Bloomberg News, Laura Dillon-Kane. Welcome to the House to you both.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me on.
Laura, we just heard the minister talking up this Canada Strong Fund. He is obviously very keen, but there are a lot of questions. Can you give me an example of one thing you still want to know about this fund?
Which projects will it invest in? I know that it's going to be managed by an independent Crown corporation, arm's length from the government with the CEO and board of directors. But we've heard a few different things. In the budget update, we heard that it would invest in projects selected by Carney's Major Projects Office and potentially in some that receive other kinds of federal support, like the Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program. But earlier, on the Monday, when Mark Carney announced this sovereign wealth fund, he said he didn't necessarily think it would be that limited to projects selected by the Major Projects Office. So the point that I'm trying to make is that this is going to be run by an independent arm's length agency, but if it's only investing in projects that are selected by the political branch of the government, then that's potentially problematic. It's not truly independent.
Mark, I think one thing a lot of folks are wondering too might be, could this be a thing for me? I mean, we were talking earlier in the show, we were in a grocery store talking to people who are having trouble paying for groceries, but some Canadians do have a little bit of cash. Mark Carney has suggested this is something they might be able to invest in. Then you have the Conservatives saying, no, this is for rich elites. What do you make of the investment opportunity here for Canadians? How do we make sense of that?
Yeah, it's kind of confusing, to be honest with you. They say there's, 3 different ways they could potentially put money into this fund. One is, stand it up with $25 billion in borrowed money to kind of kick things off. The second bit, which is hasn't been fully fleshed out yet, is this idea that, you or me or the average Canadian could buy some sort of retail investment product that, puts money into the fund and theoretically we'll get some sort of return from that. They haven't said exactly what that is. Carney's talked a little bit about it being kind of like a Canada savings bond or something like that. I think it's probably more like, something investors call a principal protected note. So that's like, it's an investment product. I can put some money in, say I put $100 in, I'm guaranteed to get $100 back. And if the fund performs a little bit better, maybe I'll earn a little bit more than that. And then the third kind of pool of capital is potentially taking money that's already existing in kind of federal assets like airports or other things and recycling that money back into this fund. But again, we got to see exactly how that works. And, when you start talking about privatization or asset optimization, you're opening up a whole different set of questions.
The Trudeau government also looked at privatizing airports and ultimately decided against it in 2017. So this has been something that's come up before. And it does seem like pension funds have been crying out for the opportunity to invest in airports, right, Mark? Because they are sort of pretty safe. They're a reliable source of income. And freeing up those airports for sale would then allow the government to recycle, as you said, that money into creating new infrastructure to grow the size of Canada's economy.
But Mark, I'm wondering, I mean, just as somebody who uses airports and other Canadians using ports and whatnot, I'm not sure what to think of this idea of an airport being privatized. What are the concerns for real people who actually use these pieces of infrastructure if they are indeed sold off?
Yeah, the P word often doesn't get the best rap in terms of, the government may not always get the best bang for their buck for it or service standards may change or whatever. But a lot of countries around the world have privatized airports. If you go and travel into the UK, a lot of those are private. Australia, a lot of private airports as well. And interestingly, Australia is an interesting example where they have done this asset recycling. They've sold off stakes in existing infrastructure, airports, ports, that kind of stuff, and they've used that money to seed their sovereign wealth fund, which can reinvest in other things. I think the kind of, the 1,000-foot view here is the government's trying to figure out the financial component of their kind of major projects push. So you got to remember they're trying to build these new mines, pipelines, ports, all with the goal of trying to diversify Canadian trade around the world, trying to, if we can't just sell to the U.S., we really do have to restructure aspects of our industrial base. It's kind of tough to go to a pension fund or like a big institution and say, hey, guys, come on, invest in these like risky mines. That's going to be a difficult thing for a pension to do. They have different risk tolerances. But, a pension might say, hey, we would love to invest in a boring old airport.
I want to switch, Laura, to the other big idea in this economic update, this $6 billion investment. The government has labeled it Team Canada Strong. This is the money for getting people into the skilled trades, tens of thousands, perhaps 100,000 new people joining the skilled trades over the course of the next 5 years or so. It is a big pot of money. Why do you think that is such a big priority for this government?
I would think of this as the human resources strategy to complement the major projects strategy. So this week we heard about the announcement of a sovereign wealth fund to inject capital into these projects, to de-risk them, to get more private investment into them and ensure that they get built. Who's going to build them? We have a severe lack of skilled tradespeople in this country. We have an issue where young people are not necessarily choosing the trades. And even when they do, they find that they can't get the apprenticeships that they're looking for, or they drop out of apprenticeships either because they're not getting the hours, or maybe it's not the right fit, or some unknown reason. It's not really clear, but about half of youth who enter apprenticeships don't actually complete them. So the government is trying to create a situation where it's actually subsidizing employers for these apprenticeships. It's offering to pay $10,000 for the first year's salary for these apprenticeships so that we can get more people to become construction workers, electrical workers, the people who are actually going to build these projects for this country.
And money for those people to stay in the apprenticeships too, because the completion rate is such a problem. I mean, my sense of this is that for the Carney government, this is not a nice to have. This is a need to have. They need this to succeed if they want their bigger agenda to work.
Absolutely. If we don't have the people to build these projects, they simply won't happen.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there is a real shortage of skilled tradespeople in the country. And, a lot of them are getting old and approaching retirement. So, you're going to have this, as you're trying to build all these projects, there's a big demand for skilled tradespeople. That's going to create a theoretically a pretty big problem if you're trying to stand up, a pipeline and a bunch of mines and a bunch of ports and all that at the same time. I mean, we have examples in recent history, like in BC in 2021, 2022. They were trying to build the Site C Dam, the Coastal GasLink, LNG Canada, and the TMX pipeline all at the same time. And there was just a massive labor crunch. Like there wasn't enough tradespeople to build all these projects. So there's also in the background, there's AI. There's a lot of young people who are worrying about the future of their jobs in a world of artificial intelligence. And so I think the
AI
government's
can't
saying,
swing a hammer, right?
Exactly. And so I think, the Carney government's saying to 18-year-olds, hey, can't guarantee you'll have a job in an AI behind a computer in a world of AI, but I promise we're going to build a whole bunch of projects, and that's going to take 15, 20 years. So maybe it's a good gig to get right now.
Okay, I want to close with I want to zoom out on this whole plan. Your biggest takeaway, and Laura, I'll start with you.
I do think it is the building big things budget update, right? One thing to look at is the cover of the budget. Justin Trudeau's budget invariably, they always had sort of a smiling middle-class family.
Indeed.
Showing the benefits of the social programs he had created. In Mark Carney's budgets, we've had a large ship and now a train. He wants to build the infrastructure that will grow the economy and grow the productive capacity of the economy, which is basically just the ability to produce stuff in an hour. And once we start doing more of that, businesses can pay us more without passing on those costs through higher prices. We get non-inflationary growth. That's the ideal. That's what he's trying to do. So you have the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is mobilizing the capital to make those big projects happen. And then you have the Skilled Trades Program, which is training up the talent to build those projects.
Quick thought from you, Mark.
They're also showing that they're willing to run big deficits to do all of this. I mean, at the end of the day, the deficit picture looked better than it did in the fall because we got big windfall profits from higher oil prices and a slightly stronger economy. But they basically spent all of that additional fiscal room they had. A lot of that was on affordability measures, the gas tax break, the groceries benefits, that kind of stuff. But, a lot of the big jump in the deficit we saw in the fall, a lot of that was military spending. A big chunk of that was also infrastructure spending. So they are willing to spend a whole lot of money, run some pretty sizable deficits through into the future in order to try to stand up this kind of major projects thing. And ultimately they're making a bet, that's for sure.
Thank you both so much for this.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Globe and Mail's Mark Rendell and Laura Dillon-Kane of Bloomberg News. Still to come on the House podcast, Timothy Snyder is known for drawing chilling similarities between authoritarian regimes of the past and current political leaders. Given those theories, I'm going to ask him how Canada should be navigating the Trump presidency. I'm Catherine Cullen. You're listening to The House, making politics make sense. Make sure to give us a follow so you never miss an episode, and tell us what you think of the show. You can email us at thehouse@cbc.ca. Timothy Snyder spends a lot of time thinking about authoritarianism and how it applies to this moment in the United States. He says the words we use, like debating whether the president can be called an oligarch, are less important than Americans' daily experience.
Is it not the case that books are pulled from library shelves? Is it not the case that college students can no longer protest? Is it not the case that college professors are self-censoring and canceling classes? Is it not the case that our tax authorities are no longer pursuing people who are very wealthy? Is it not the case that people right around the president are making huge amounts of money from this war? And in general, Is it not the case that the rhetoric that comes from people in the White House is more violent and divisive than it's ever been?
You might know Snyder's best-selling books, On Tyranny and On Freedom. He also used to teach history at Yale, but is now with the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. I got a chance to talk with Timothy Snyder earlier this week. I wanted to know how he thinks Canada should respond to this moment in history and whether Mark Carney is living up to his own Davos speech. Here's part of that conversation. Prime Minister Mark Carney offered a response to this moment, a political response in that widely discussed speech he gave at Davos. And he called on middle powers to work together to stand up to superpowers, hegemons like the United States, and to recognize that the international world order doesn't actually work, certainly not for everyone. Do you think his was the right response to this moment?
I want to just start with a caveat about hegemons, because part of the problem for Canada is not necessarily American strength. Part of the problem for Canada is American weakness. So we are behaving in a way which is undignified and unreliable. But we're also behaving in such a way as to drastically reduce our own ability to affect matters beyond our borders. The United States, under its current leadership, is engaged in the catastrophic self-destruction of its own power, which means that even if we abstract away from American threats to Canada, Canada is looking at a world in which its trusted ally is no longer trusted, perhaps, but also, even if it were trusted, is not the same kind of power as it was before. So, but that said, I think it is the right response. I think one has to have an active response. I think as soon as you simply react to whatever China is doing or whatever Russia is doing or whatever now the Americans are doing, you are in some sense falling into their story. And what their story has in common right now, sadly, Washington, Moscow, and Beijing, is that this is a multipolar world. It's just a kind of roughhouse affair. Only power matters, and we're the only powers. And that's a dangerous story to fall into. And if you're Canada, it's not really true. Canada does have a great deal of agency in the world, more than Canadians usually realize. And I think the Prime Minister is exactly right to say that there are allies out there to be found and to be strengthened. And yeah, personally, I tend to think that the answer to China, the answer to the US, the answer to Russia, is something like a looser, tighter coalition of middle powers democracies, with the core probably in the European Union, and with Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and Canada playing important roles.
How effectively would you say the world is following through then on Mark Carney's call?
There are some good signs. I mean, look, the work is being disproportionately done by the Ukrainians. I mean, I'm in Ontario, which is a safe part of the world. I was in Ukraine a couple of months ago. I've been in Ukraine regularly since the war started. And I think it's important to remember that the most important middle power in the world is precisely Ukraine. They're the ones who are halting a land invasion, thereby fulfilling the NATO mission, even as the Americans talk about pulling out of NATO. They're the ones who are showing that great powers can, in fact, be resisted, even in situations that seem far more hopeless than the ones that Canadians are in. So Ukraine is one example of a middle power which is pulling far, far more than its weight. And although the situation, all in all, is horrifying and terrible, there is encouragement to be drawn from that. Beyond the Ukrainians, I would say that the Germans and the French are both, if too slowly, moving in the right direction. Their chancellor and their president saying sensible and admirable things in public. And the same could be said for the British government, and the Polish government as well. So I think, although it's been way too slow, and it's been, as an American, it's been kind of painful to watch how Europeans hope for things to be better than they are. I think the drift is generally in the right direction, at least among a few important countries.
If we look specifically at how the world responded to the U.S.-Israel war on Iran, it was kind of the first litmus test, in a way, of what Carney put on the world stage, you saw a lot of traditional American allies, including Canada, refusing to get directly involved. What do you make of that?
Well, Personally, I mean, look, I'm a historian. I sit on the sidelines. I don't take political. I mean, okay, maybe I don't sit on the sidelines, but I don't have electoral political responsibility. So one has to remember that whatever is done is going to be a constellation of a number of factors, domestic and foreign. My first take is that chances were missed to say things clearly in the first days of the war that people then started to say clearly later on. This was always a war of aggression. It was always illegal. And also, it was pretty much doomed from the start. So whether you were thinking in terms of moral or legal terms, or whether you were worried about strategy and the position of America or NATO or the West in the world, this was a foreseeable disaster right from the get-go. And I do wish more people had taken some view like that at the beginning. That said, and I think you're suggesting, the fact that America's closest allies are essentially watching and doing perhaps a bit on the sideline and not hindering is historically different. Not surprising, because the American administration has spent so much time belittling and insulting the allies and claiming it doesn't need them, and then rejecting offers of help. And then even when help is being offered, as for example by Ukraine, claiming that it's not being offered, it's very easy to see why allies would react in the way that they've done. But I guess the way I would characterize it is that this war in Iran is so wildly counterproductive from pretty much every possible point of view that it gives other countries a moment where they can pause and consider what their relationship with the U.S. should be.
I do just want to ask you quickly, you talked about that initial response right out of the gate. Mark Carney's first response was to side with the United States and Israel on those initial strikes, although within a few days' time he said, this likely is a violation of international law. We call on everyone involved to essentially bring down the temperature. Do you think Canada made a mistake, the Prime Minister made a mistake in responding that way right out of the gate?
This is a very funny exchange, because I was trying to be very Canadian and indirect, and then you called me on it. Yes, that is exactly what I think, and that's exactly what I meant. And I'm glad some of those steps were retraced. Yeah,
Okay.
That's exactly what I meant. It wasn't only
Okay.
Canada, and it's understandable. I mean, there are domestic things in Canada too that point in that direction, but also it's understandable. Like the reflex to go along with the Americans, it's understandable. It's just a reflex that has to be actively resisted at this point, because not only, I mean, I'm sorry to say this, it pains me to say this, I wish I didn't have to say things like this, but not only is what they're doing very likely to be morally and legally wrong, it's also almost certain to be strategically wrong, because they're just wildly incompetent. And so whatever move they're making, it's going to turn out to be worse than it seems in the begining.
I am interested to hear that you're starting to have a Canadian disposition now, only a year or two in. You should look out for that, Timothy Snyder. But I'm going to draw a little bit more on what you are seeing here in Canada. I wonder how you reflect on the health of democracy in this country.
It's such a hard question to answer, because so much in Canada is seen relative to the U.S. And I want to resist the temptation to say everything is great because things in the U.S. are getting worse. Never having said that, it is, one does experience just a kind of existential and almost like corporeal relief in being in a country where parliamentary democracy isn't actively challenged every day, and where the rule of law generally functions, and where scandals are small and medium size as opposed to extra large every single time. I want to say that I think there have been some positive reactions on various parts of the Canadian political spectrum to what's happened in the U.S. I think it's wise, and no doubt there are Canadians who understand this far better than me, but I think it's wise for the opposition, whether it's at the provincial or the national level, to agree when it can on basic things like strategic or existential questions involving the United States. And it's heartening to see that when it does happen. I think it's not only dignified, but strategically wise for the major political parties to be able to talk to one another, regardless of who's in the majority. In terms of the government, I think it's wise for the Prime Minister to stress the ability to get things done with a majority. That's a difference between the United States, where we just can't pass laws regardless of what happens. I think it's wise for him to emphasize the positive and the constructive, which is not that's not a direct confrontation with the United States. It is a de facto contrast with the United States, though. And I think it's wise for the Prime Minister, as we were discussing, to try to sketch out, however it materializes, to try to sketch out imaginatively what the future could look like, rather than just waiting for what the Americans are doing. So, I going back to your previous question, the things that I worry about are the things that I kind of feel like I feel day to day that I remember from earlier in the US, right? Like social media, not quite the same problem here that it is in the US, but a problem, Wealth inequality, have to keep one's eyes on that. Influence campaigns, right? Unfortunately, now, the Russian influence campaigns in the U.S. were a bad thing. Now the Americans seem to be carrying out influence campaigns, as of course the Russians are also doing in Canada. All of these things are things to be watched. But
you're talking about Alberta specifically?
I'm talking about. There I am with my Canadian misdirection again. Yes, I'm talking about Alberta, of course. Yeah.
You've learned quickly. I laugh, but of course the subject is incredibly serious, and we may well find ourselves we feel that we are on the cusp, perhaps, of a referendum on sovereignty for the province of Alberta. What counsel would you give Canadians when you see that line of influence coming from the United States about trying to manage this domestically?
Yeah, I have two reference points without pretending to be an expert on Alberta and without pretending, to have any standpoint from which to tell Canadians in Alberta or elsewhere what they should be doing. My two reference points are, number one, the significance of cross-border influence campaigns in general, which have mattered in recent history to an extent with I'm not sure has been fully appreciated. To just drop us away from the North American setting for a moment, in Brexit, out-of-country influence campaigns were incredibly important, very, very possibly decisive at what was, of course, a crucial moment in the history of the United Kingdom. It matters a lot that the United Kingdom is not in the European Union right now. And yet the internet traffic on crucial platforms such as Twitter were driven at that time by external actors, primarily Russia, to an extent which was meaningful and not really understood. And so if you're the Canadian national government, it's proper and it's appropriate to be concerned about about your informational sovereignty, by which I don't mean that you get to tell people what to think or censor or anything like that, but that it's proper to think of the state not just in territorial terms, but also in terms of what goes in and out informationally. The second point of reference I have is, of course, Ukraine, where it's, and I think other Ukraine experts or East European experts here in Canada would say very similar things, that it is eerily familiar to those of us who watched the Donbass, who watched the Donetsk and Luhansk provinces and the escalation there, where it started with cross-border information campaigns, financial incentives, visits, and then before you know it, there's a paramilitary element and then a straight-up military element to it. And what one learns from the example of the Donbass, which of course is where the war in Ukraine begins, is that these things can go step by step by step by step, and you cannot be sure at exactly what moment you've lost control, and the outcome can then in fact be very bad indeed. And so it is something that one should take seriously.
What would you say to Canadians who would say, really, Ukraine? I mean, this is Alberta. Well, the two parallels seem so deeply different. Who might question those parallels that you're making?
I wonder what's the difference? That Canada's a magical place where nothing bad ever happens and its neighbors are always friendly. I mean, the resemblance is an objective one. It doesn't have to do with which country we're talking about. Sad to say, I mean, the resemblance is also an empirical one, in that the Americans seem to have picked up some of the techniques that the Russians were in fact using. But I mean, I appreciate the question, because there's a sort of tension or back and forth in this conversation where sometimes we're talking about Canada and sometimes we're talking about authoritarianism in general. One of the things that I learned in America and about Americans, and I'm not going to say whether it's true about Canadians or not, I think it's probably less true of you folks, but I'm not sure. One of the things about Americans which makes them vulnerable is their exceptionalism. They tend to say, well, it happens in other countries, but it can't happen here because who knows, the founding fathers, the Constitution, whatever it might be. And the moment you say it can't happen here is the moment that you're asking it to happen here. It's not neutral to say it can't happen here. That's exposing a vulnerability known as exceptionalism. These kinds of things can happen anywhere.
I mean, what you are saying there carries such profound weight. And yet at the very same moment, of course, we continue to have deep ties to the United States. And there is this effort at this very moment to try to work out some of those economic ties, right? This sense of a precipice over the future of free trade with the U.S. and Mexico, even with all the assurances that Canadian officials are trying to offer that, going forward, this review, it's just a checkpoint. What would you say about the challenge of finding a path forward on an economic relationship that is at once so crucial to the day-to-day well-being of so many people in this country, and yet becomes fraught when you are talking about the political challenges of what is happening at this very moment?
So I'm not sure it's actually as complicated as all that. Honestly, the Americans are not very good at trade wars. We seem to be losing quite a few of them. You can play hardball with us. The fact that we are having domestic political turmoil has not made us better trade negotiators that I've noticed. It does mean that we do short-sighted things that hurt you sometimes more than they hurt us, but it doesn't mean that we particularly have the patience and the wherewithal to get our own way in trade negotiations. So I think I would slightly decouple those issues and just say Canadians would be well advised to simply pursue their interests and be prepared to be patient and recognize that they have, to use the dread Trump term, they recognize that they have cards to play as well. So I think that, plus what you've already referred to, the long-term plan to make sure that things are diversified, is really the only way to go.
One of the 20 lessons from your book on tyranny deals with learning from peers in other countries, and you specifically call for friendships across borders. I wonder what you would say to Canadians about the bigger picture importance of friendships with people in the United States right now, even though there are times where our countries might feel politically at odds.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting because I could take that question in a sentimental direction, but I'm not going to. I will say something nice though, which is that it is really it's inspiring how gracious Canadians are in general with Americans, or at least with Americans who come up here. I've been trying to explain this when I go back to the States, and the phrase that I found is that they're more gracious with us than we are with each other, which isn't to say that you don't have your thoughts about us, as well you should, but it is to say that there's a level of civility and even friendliness with us, which is quite impressive, and maybe even something from which we could perhaps learn a bit. So I just wanted to register that before I try to answer the question. The point of that lesson was that it's good to learn from people who have faced similar problems before you have, or who have perhaps faced graver problems than you. And what that would mean for Canadians would be something very specific. Listen to Americans who have been trying to prevent these developments in the US, because there are quite a few of them. Try to use your friendships with Americans not to tell them that everything is going to be okay, but try to use your friendships with Americans to ascertain where and how things went wrong and how they felt things going wrong, because that can help you understand possible risks for Canada. I think that's how that lesson would apply here.
You talk about possible risks for Canada, possible risks of this moment. I mean, one thing we haven't gotten to in the course of this conversation is you've warned about the possibility of a coup in the United States. Help us understand that.
Oh, I mean, it's unrolling before our eyes. We're like, it's so hard to talk about the U.S. because everything that happens is immediately normalized by us. We are great normalizers, and then that normalization has a way of sort of radiating outwards. And so whatever drastic thing happens, it then just immediately becomes the new point of comparison for the next wild thing that's going to happen. So what I've been talking about specifically is the risk, or what I would say is the very predictable risk, of some kind of electoral stunt between now and November, when we have these very consequential congressional elections, of course. And the stunts are already underway. The war in Iran was for no doubt many things. One hesitates even to guess. But certainly, now that the war is going on, the people in power, Trump and Hegseth in particular, very clearly use the war to try to define friends and enemies inside the United States, to declare that other people are not patriots and so on. So that is already underway. It's just not working very well because the war was poorly conceived. It's being lost, and it's wildly unpopular for obvious reasons. Something similar can be said with Mr. Trump's recent propensity to compare himself to Jesus Christ. It's a stunt. It's an electoral stunt. The idea is to make a direct connection which goes around the institutions, around the elections, to people who are willing to go to war for him because he has a non-democratic legitimacy for rule as a Christian nationalist or what have you. That also didn't turn out very well for him. And I would be very surprised if there weren't more stunts down the line. But the fact that there are stunts it reflects badly on him. But one can be malicious and incompetent at the same time. One can intend the worst while at the same time being stoppable. And I think that's the position that Mr. Trump is in. He would, I think, do pretty much anything to stay in power, but that doesn't mean that he's capable of doing things. So the message I'm trying to get across is that these things will continue to happen in the U.S., but that doesn't mean that Americans can't anticipate them, block them, or even turn them against the president in such a way that the elections end up being even worse for him than they would have been otherwise.
I just want to close on that thought. You say, block them, anticipate them. It is the possibility of actions of everyday Americans that gives you the most hope right now? Where do you find hope for the future of the United States?
Hope's the right word, and I'm glad you used it. People talk about optimism and pessimism. I think those terms are too cold. Democracy succeeds when people think they belong to the people. And it seems like a very simple thing, but when we're alone, when we're inactive, we're isolated, when we're lonely, then we feel powerless, and we are powerless. But when we act together, when we do things together, when we get to know each other, when we find ourselves capable of cooperating with others with whom we may not agree on every single issue, then we feel more powerful, and we are more powerful. I think the opposition party, the Democrats, are going to do very well in these elections. For me, the question is, do they understand why they're going to do so well? And the reason why they're going to do so well is that people are angry, and people are expressing their anger in local organization, in mass protests, in many other ways. So I think the news in the United States is not just the latest outrage, be it of our war or be it of Trump and his allies' attempts to change the regime. The news in the United States is also that of people not following along, not obeying in advance, filing lawsuits, going out to protest, trying to defend institutions, and building up a coalition, which is not just an opposition party, but which is also a protest movement and other groups. I think that's actually the real story. And for me, the issue is whether outside observers can help here by paying attention less to Trump and more to people who are active. But in general, I think it comes down to whether Americans themselves realize how much of this is in their hands.
Okay, we'll leave the conversation there. I appreciate your time and your thoughts today. Thank you.
Very glad. Thank you.
Author and historian Timothy Snyder. Okay, that's it for us this week. Our crew on the house is Kristen Everson, Laura Glowacki, Benjamin Lopez-Steven, and our senior producer is Jennifer Chevalier. Technical production by Miguel Plante. I'm Catherine Cullen. Thank you so much for listening.